Welcome to episode 3 of the Summer Series Shutdown. You're joined by your usual co-host, AMG Denz, aka Jazzy Denz. And I'm very excited to bring a very popular star guest by demand on the show. It's professional driving coach and racing driver, Brad Philpot. Man like brothers. How's everything going, man? What have you been up to during the summer break so far? Oh, and you left.
Yep,
And you left.
he
And
went.
you left me
He
again.
left.
Man, that
Yeah.
was the perfect intro as well. You know I'm not going to catch it so cleanly next time. Hey, he's back.
Guys,
He's back.
guys, I'm sorry. I listened to the whole intro. I didn't leave. It just wouldn't let me unmute. I clicked unmute, and so I'm not going to mute myself again. I was here listening to that
Yeah.
awesome intro, and I was like, "Hi, Denz," and you couldn't hear anything I said. So I'm sorry. I'm back. I won't mute myself again. I promise.
It's fine. It's fine. Well, Brad, this question to you, man, is how are you doing and what have you been up to during the summer break so far?
Oh, I'm doing fine. I've been really busy recently. So I've had a lot of work. I've had some racing, which is quite unusual for me at the moment. I've not been doing a whole lot of racing, but recently I've been doing a little bit. Currently, I've just actually arrived at my hotel in the south of France to do a week of tyre testing for Goodyear. So I'm all over the place, traveling all over Europe, home for a week next week, and then back out here again for some more. So lots of flights and lots of driving around tracks.
Hey, sounds fun, and most obviously as well, like we're super happy that you're being kept busy and being put to good uses as well. So we'll definitely dive into a lot of the driving aspects of it and the racing as well too, because there's so much to unpack. And even in terms of the Formula One this year, it's been absolutely crazy. So probably to start off with it, Brad, let's go for the F1 season so far. So we've literally just completed the first half of the season with these new regulations. Question is, Brad, is in your view, has the FIA been successful in what they set out to achieve? And what have you made of the variety of races we've seen on offer so far?
Yeah, so I'll be completely honest. I was not convinced by these cars for the first few races. I don't really like the way they've looked on track. I thought they looked a bit wooden. I thought they looked a bit cumbersome at low speeds. But I have to say, I think the teams are starting to grow into them. Maybe it's just that we're getting used to watching them as a spectator sport. But I think the teams have developed them as you'd expect. And I think the drivers are finding them a bit more like a normal Formula One car to drive. So in terms of the way the regulations have worked and how close they're allowing each other to follow, I think that's been a pretty decent success so far. And unless they let it get out of hand, and unless teams develop the cars to exploit the regulations and add more aero devices which weren't intended and add a bit more dirty air, if that doesn't happen, I think this regulation set may well end up being a real success. So that's a good positive. In terms of the season, the racing, we can probably all agree that we've been let down a bit by Ferrari, because it really was going to be Ferrari versus Red Bull this year. Mercedes were never really going to feature. Maybe they're going to feature in the second half, but in terms of the championship fight, I think we can probably all agree that's gone. And Ferrari were the hope in terms of keeping Red Bull honest and giving us something exciting to watch. But that's gone, hasn't it? We're looking at a Red Bull whitewash at this point, and Verstappen's going to walk to the title, and Red Bull are almost certainly going to win the Constructors' Championship at a canter. So that's the real shame of the season, is Ferrari's wasting of their car and drivers.
Absolutely, Brad. And you made some really exceptional points, in an honest review as well of what's been going on. Because, like you mentioned, as you mentioned that to kind of start with, like when we first saw the cars in testing, there was a lot of lockups, a lot of like clumsy little mistakes, understeer, drivers not really too happy with the balance of the car. As you mentioned, kind of as the season's progressed, we're starting to see a trend and we're starting to see teams really get used to the cars. Drivers like Sergio Perez have been given like a new lease of life at certain tracks, to really ring out the performance of the cars and make the most of them. But I think you're absolutely correct as well. We still have to be a bit cautious and see where the development goes in the future. we've seen teams like Aston Martin bring some really revolutionary new upgrades to the cars, such as the new rear wing with the end fence curtains, which could potentially cause wake that would be against kind of the will of the new regulations. And as you mentioned as well, in terms of bringing the racing closer with a car following another in dirty air, it seems to have nullified that and made it a lot more easier to follow. But still, I think critically at the same time, the gap between, Red Bull, for example, and the lower teams or the kind of private teams seems to be quite gaping. So still probably a lot of work to do there if they want to make things or adjustments to the cost cap and to kind of rebalance the playing field as well to give everybody a sliding chance of performance. But you also mentioned there as well, Brad, just like the situation with Ferrari and Red Bull 2. We're going to have a very nice grilling of Ferrari later on in the show. We're going to bring a segment on for them too. But just from a driving perspective, what have you made of Max's driving style this year in relation to Charles? Because I think the public opinion is that he goes racing slightly differently with Charles. And it'd be interesting to get the driver's perspective as to whether something like that plays in your mind after the very intense battle he had with Lewis the season before.
Yeah, so it'll be no surprise to anyone to learn that I'm not a big Max Verstappen fan, and largely that was because of his kind of on-track conduct last year. I thought he was out of order in a number of areas last year in terms of his racecraft, the way he battled Hamilton, and without going into specifics, he drove me away from being a Max Verstappen fan last year. I think it's changed drastically this year, probably largely in part to the fact that he feels he has less to prove. As far as he was concerned last year, he had no idea whether the 2022 Red Bull would be competitive. He had no idea that he was going to walk to a championship in 2022. So from his perspective, he had to beat Hamilton. It might have been his only chance for a championship, and he did everything he could to make that happen. And that included driving well beyond the limit of what I would say is acceptable racecraft. This year, he's been much more respectful in every on-track battle I've seen. Obviously, the majority of which have been with Leclerc in terms of wheel to wheel when they've been fighting on track. And I think a lot of people have commented on this, that Verstappen has seemed like a different driver this year. And that really goes to show how a different mindset, a different place in your career, although it's only 1 year later, having a championship behind you and a strong car for the season really does affect your mindset. And he's playing the long game and the more respectful long game this season. He's treated Charles much more normally in a way that we didn't really see last year. So in terms of Verstappen's general driving, he deserves his championship lead, I think, this year. He's been the strongest. Him and Red Bull have been the strongest package. He's not really done a whole lot wrong, a couple of small mistakes, but the spin at Hungary, which didn't amount to anything in the end. It's really been the big story for me this season has been Ferrari throwing away a potential championship challenge. So Verstappen and Red Bull have just done what they needed to do. They've not really put a foot wrong, really. And Ferrari have thrown away victories and points that were on offer. And it's made Red Bull's advantage look exaggerated. So that's in terms of the driving side, though, Verstappen's been the strongest. I think he is the deserving championship leader.
Yep, and I think not a lot of people would find it easy to argue against that, Brad, because as you mentioned as well, just on pure performance, pure pace, and just picking his moments wisely, he's got himself into a nice situation where he can be quite comfortable. Obviously, we know reliability plays a big factor in winning a championship. And at the beginning of the year, Red Bull didn't really seem to have it all together, but as they've grown and developed throughout the season, it seems they've definitely found that reliability factor and works even more closer to make sure they don't compromise performance whilst bringing that reliability back into it. But one other question I wanted to kind of get onto as well, Brad, this on the same topic as well, to dive in a bit deeper, the psychological element of it, man, because last year when we were watching the battles with Max and Lewis, we knew that Lewis was quite respectful and maybe at times maybe too respectful and would leave Max's space, and try and like live to fight for another day and always be evasive in trying to avoid contact with Max at all times. Whereas we know with Charles, he's more from like the PlayStation generation, as F1 Black would say. Shout out to Black. And just generally speaking, he's more fearless. He's more kind of ruthless in his commitment to putting a move on somebody. As a driver yourself, Brad, as a racer, is that something psychologically that plays in your mind when you're making decisions on the fly as to whether to commit to a move, whether to defend, whether to run somebody off the road? The profile of the driver you're racing, and I know that you race a lot with, some other drivers we'll discuss, Ramon Pinheiro and some of the best, in the racing scene. When you get to know a driver and their characteristics and their strengths and weaknesses, is that something also that psychologically plays in your mind? Oh, and he's, I think he would need to not lock his phone because, yeah, he's out again. But I'm sure he'll be back. Hey, Brad.
I'm still here. Somebody called me and it put me on mute and it wouldn't let me unmute myself. But I heard everything you said. So to answer your question, sorry to give you more editing work to do, Jorgy. To answer your question, yes, basically, the situation massively changes how a driver will approach driving situations. And as we said before, Max definitely was coming from a place in 2021 of having something to prove, of wanting to take it to the incumbent multiple world champion. And Lewis was driving with his learned position of it's better to live to fight another day. And you can't blame Lewis for expecting a certain behavior from another driver based on what he's learned from pretty much every other driver he's ever raced. Max just took things a step further. And I think had Lewis known what the outcome would be, had he known the level to which Verstappen was willing to go, when we look at things like Brazil last year, where Verstappen was just willing to push well beyond what we'd ever accepted as racecraft, which wouldn't be penalised. Had Lewis known that, he probably would have kind of nipped it in the bud earlier. I think Silverstone was an example of where Hamilton had just had enough of being pushed around, and it was the one time he just didn't yield. And because Verstappen had become accustomed to Hamilton always yielding, he turned in and they had an accident. And obviously everyone has their own opinion on that. But if Lewis had not yielded earlier, maybe we wouldn't have arrived at that point. But you also can't blame Lewis for that, because every other driver he'd ever encountered in his career would have stopped before getting to that point. They would have arrived at a racecraft balance where they had an earlier line in terms of what you could get away with. So anyway, Verstappen has just kind of changed the game slightly in that respect. And this year, without having quite so much to prove, with a bit more of a relaxed mental attitude, and maybe with the view that he's got this championship covered, I think he's just been a bit more mature in his driving, which is not. He's driven a lot more like a normal front-running Formula One driver in the battles, and you haven't seen him just driving to an apex when there's already a car there. It's been a very different perspective, and I know that's been quite frustrating for certainly for Hamilton fans, seeing that difference and thinking, why couldn't you have done that last year? Why couldn't we have had a fairer?
Wait for him to come back, Jorgy. Oh, you're gonna love editing this one.
Sorry,
hey
guys,
there, Brad.
I'm back again. I keep getting phone calls, and even though I hang up immediately, it mutes the call, and I can't unmute. It doesn't allow me to unmute with Anchor.
All right, Brad. Well, we'll segue into the next question as well, because this is something, as a fan, I've been super, super happy to see. And big up your damn self as well, Brad. It's amazing content. We have to talk about the very new series you've launched, a successful series on YouTube called Behind the Visor. It gives amazing content highlighting hot topics from each race weekend. And one of the hot topics I've seen you explore, a lot in great detail and it's very fascinating as well to get your perspective on, is the infamous etiquette of forcing a driver off the track, which I guess is very linked to the topic we just discussed. And again, we've had a couple of incidents, of like Max Verstappen forcing Mick off the track at Silverstone, although you could argue maybe because of the floor damage, the handling characteristics were outed there. There's also the move Sergio Perez did onto Lewis Hamilton on turn 3 when he's trying to get the position back. And then they didn't penalize those ones, the FIA, but then when it came to other offenses like George Russell, like basically understeering into Checo, or Checo turning into George, as some people saw it, the stewards took a more dim view of it. I know you explained it on the channel, but for our listeners at home as well, could you explain some of the thought process that goes behind these decisions and how the FIA call, what is a racing incident and what is actually, like a punishable offense?
Yes. Okay. So thank you for highlighting the new YouTube series. So actually, it's probably pretty bad timing because I've been away for a couple of weeks and we had a couple of back-to-back races. I've actually missed out on recording good through the visor episodes for the last couple of races for France and Hungary. And the reason was really, I just didn't get to watch the races properly because I was away and I didn't have good TV coverage. I only really caught the highlights and I didn't think it did it justice to answer people's questions when I hadn't really watched the race myself properly. But hopefully we're back to normal from now on and I'll get to do it properly. But yeah, the racing rules have been a bit different this year. We were essentially promised a stricter policing of racecraft for this season. And we all thought that drivers would have to be more polite, to put it frankly. You'd have to avoid forcing another driver off in order to be deemed to be legal. But it turns out that there were these clarifications, which I go into in my videos on my YouTube channel. But essentially, that isn't actually the case. It was more a case of putting the focus on the overtaking driver having more of an overlap in order to be allowed racing room. So unless a driver who was making a pass around the outside, for example, was around 50% alongside, the defending driver was legally within their rights to actually just drive them clean off the track, which is pretty much the opposite to what, as fans, we thought we were getting this year. And for most of the first few races, certainly, we assumed that was the case. And then it all started to kind of come to a head at Silverstone, where there were several occasions where I think particularly the Red Bull drivers, Perez on a couple of occasions and certainly Verstappen on Schumacher on the final laps, were forcing drivers clean off the track. And when that was questioned, it was pointed out that the clarifications in the driving rules actually said that unless that attacking driver was further ahead, so 50% or more effectively, that they weren't entitled to any room. The defending driver could do whatever they wanted to do. And some of us disagree with that. Some people don't care. Some people probably agree. From my point of view, I think everyone should be allowed space. Whenever there's any kind of overlap, you should be allowed room. Doesn't mean you have to be allowed past, but it just means you need to not be driven clean off the track. And from my personal view, that encourages better racing. It allows the moves to continue for corner after corner. And as I say, I go into this in a bit more detail on the YouTube series, but as the rules stand, there are more lenient views taken on the defending driver in lots of circumstances, and you are allowed to squeeze people off. I can't comment too deeply on the more recent races, on things that George Russell did at France versus Perez, purely because I couldn't see it very well. In the highlights I saw and the kind of video clips I saw, it wasn't super clear, and it seemed like the letter of the regulations said one thing, like potentially by the letter of the rules, George was maybe right, but by the common sense interpretation, maybe he wasn't. And I'm a bit disappointed by the way this has been enforced, because I think it could be made simpler. I have my own views on the ways this could be made a lot simpler and easy to understand, so we weren't having to refer to a rule book every time a move was made. And I am going to make a video on this. I am going to try and go into a bit more detail and give Brad's version of the rules. Not that most people will probably care, but I just think there's an easier way to police this, which would ultimately be more fair. But maybe we'll leave that for a slow news week.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point as well, Brad, that you mentioned too. Like, as a fan, it's always a bit conflicting and it's always a bit kind of frustrating when one thing said one week and then it doesn't apply to a particular driver or a particular team, a particular group of events. The other weird thing as well is the FIA saying that essentially in the Perez instance, it was like if a car was on the outside or if a car on the outside was ahead by the apex of the corner, then they were entitled to racing room. But at that stage, when you're at the apex, you've already committed, you've already got the wheel turned, you've already like got the car in its most kind of transitionary phase. So how Russell was to avoid contact with Sergio, for example, in that instance, I don't know, and it's strange to me, like you mentioned
Exactly.
as well. Mhm.
Exactly, and the apex itself. I mean, where is the apex defined? It's another thing we talk about a bit on Through the Visor is that the apex is not a it's not like a point that you can show at every corner, which is the same. It's like a uniform section of the corner for every driver. The apex is totally situation dependent. The apex for different drivers in different situations is in a different position. So using that as a reference point in the rules is a really silly idea, because I could apex much earlier if I wanted to, if I was trying to prove a point that I'd made the apex earlier. But the ideal apex might be somewhere totally different. And in fact, you can't point to a real defined point because where the best apex is entirely dependent on what you're trying to achieve. Are you defending? Are you attacking? Do you have new tires, old tires? How much downforce do you have? Is it wet? Is it dry? It's just it's almost an arbitrary term, really, the apex. And it's totally situation dependent. So yeah, having that as part of the driving etiquette regulations seems a bit silly and short-sighted to me.
Sure, sure. And I think a lot of us would agree with you on that as well, Brad, because like you said, it's that in itself is it's not so definitive. And like I'm so happy that you said it as well and explained it in that way for our listeners to understand too. There's so many ways you could judge an apex, and it's very circumstantial on the car you're driving and the other variant factors you mentioned too. It's a great point. And this is a segue on to another hot topic that you've discussed on Through the Visor as well. Again, I implore our listeners to go and check out Brad's channel and obviously this series because it's eye-opening and it's really, really, really informative. I love it. I make sure that I've got my subscription in, I've got my bell notification on, and all the good stuff. So you guys need to make sure you do that too. But another hot topic that keeps trending upon the internet too is the issue of track limits. We saw a number of offences go quite rampant at the Austrian GP. We even saw Sergio Perez get basically retrospectively punished for making it into Q3 when his Q2 lap was by the FIA standards not like legal. In your eye, Brad, like, can the FIA do more to monitor this issue and to police it more consistently?
Yes, you have. The moment you mentioned the words track limits, I was sat here in my hotel room grinning because this is such a hot button topic for me. Um, I had I had hoped, I had assumed that with the FIA taking more of a strict view on track limits and penalising drivers in qualifying and deleting lap times if they deemed the car to be outside the track limits, I had just assumed and hoped that they had better evidence on the TV because a lot of times we were shown the TV images and when told this driver has had a lap time deleted, whether it's Perez or Gasly or whoever, and the view that we were seeing, there was no way you could categorically tell me that you knew that driver had exceeded track limits. It's impossible to tell from the TV views we had. Yet at Hungary, I believe, unless I'm very much mistaken, we were having examples of drivers having laps deleted for track limits and then reinstated. I think it was Perez in this case, reinstated when the team provided evidence from other angles that actually he was within track limits. And it turned out that the FIA really are using the TV cameras, the onboards, to judge whether or not a car has gone outside those limits. For Gasly, for example, the deletion he had most recently was from a visor cam. It wasn't even from a fixed camera on the car. It was from his visor cam. And there is absolutely no way you can say for sure that that car was outside track limits. And I was pretty stunned when I learned this, because it's one thing if you take a static TV camera and you can say maybe the FIA have done measurements and they've deemed that even though you can't categorically see from this view that the tyre was outside the track limits, maybe from this particular view you can apply some kind of calculation and you know for sure if the camera position is in a certain place, that means the tyre cannot be touching the white line. That isn't the case. It definitely is not the case with a visor cam where the driver's head is dynamic and not even in a fixed position. So they're basically making a guess, like a judgment call. So I'm all for track limits. I am a massive proponent of penalising drivers who put all four wheels outside the playing surface. If this was tennis or football or cricket, we would be super strict on this. And there are technological systems in place to make sure that when the call is made, we know it's the correct one. You've got Hawkeye or whatever the goal line technology is in different sports. But in Formula One, it actually seems like the stewards are literally looking at the same onboard videos that we get and going, yeah, it looks like he's outside. Let's penalise him. And I think that is not remotely acceptable. Why on earth, in the most technological sport on the planet, do we not have fixed cameras at the corners on each track where you know drivers will exploit track limits that can just show for definite, was that in or out? I could buy on Amazon for £39 a 1080p camera that would, a wireless CCTV Wi-Fi camera that would do this job. So why do we not have this system in Formula One? I worked at a race school for years where drivers could experience single-seaters and other prototype-style cars, where there was an automatic system where if a car went all four wheels outside the white lines, you immediately had the lap time disallowed. Why 15 years in the future Formula One doesn't have a system remotely as good as that is beyond me. I know I've just blabbed on for ages, but I'm quite passionate about this particular subject.
No, Brad, I know it's a hot topic, and also it's alarming. Those things you mentioned as well, that, we live in a day and age where Formula One is a multi-billionaire sport, like, in terms of the investment, technology, resources available to the FIA. And when you see that they're relying on such basic methods which aren't accurate and actually are very inconsistent, it is something which is quite distressing and also doesn't provide you with much confidence that they know what they're doing. They're going to police things in a consistent and fair manner. We talked about CCTV and like basically having like more surveillance and actual, evidence and sensors and stuff like this. But one thing I feel that we maybe should discuss as well, and be interesting to get your view on, is not only just like catching the offenders, but deterring the offenders. Because another thing that gets like rubber banded on the internet as well is, well, why don't you put a gravel trap, on the exit of the circuit so the drivers don't, go beyond the limits? Because if you put a gravel trap there, they're less likely to push the envelope. And I guess, to be fair to those people, I've seen Spa has been drastically updated with changes to Eau Rouge, and new kind of facilities added for fans. But from a driving point of view as well, I took away from the 24 hours of Spa that they've changed La Source, which is the first corner. And it used to be the case where there was this tarmac on the outside. So I think we saw a year where Fernando Alonso completely ran off the circuit and then gained an advantage by basically flooring it from the entire way off the circuit all the way through Radian and then Eau Rouge through the Camel Straight. But then this year in the GT3 racing, for example, they've put some gravel traps there. So if the drivers dip a wheel onto the gravel, it will penalize them all the way up going through Radion and Eau Rouge, and it's likely to cost them time and performance. So you've got things like gravel traps and obviously sausage curbs as well, which is another health and safety-esque kind of like prevention method that we've also seen introduced. What are your thoughts on these deterrents?
Yeah, so we have to be mindful that car racing isn't the only kind of motorsport that takes place on a lot of these tracks. Mm-hmm. So although for our sport, gravel traps are pretty much fine, it doesn't really, it's good to have a physical deterrent like a gravel trap on the exit of a corner. For something like MotoGP, I think they do prefer to have tarmac runoff. I think for motorbike racing, we have to make a kind of compromise. I mean, sausage curbs, I think we should be rid of them by now. I don't think they're necessary. I think they're bad for both sports, as we've seen multiple examples of. But gravel trap, I mean, certainly the easiest from our point of view, the easiest deterrent to drivers exceeding track limits is a physical disadvantage. You know, if you go beyond the track limits, it makes your lap time slower, so the drivers stop doing it, and there's less need to penalise people who have gone beyond track limits in that case, because they have not gained an advantage, because it was worse to go wider. They've lost themselves time. The problem is, it's not always the safest way to have a physical deterrent, and that's why we've ended up with, you know, seas of tarmac runoff area or asphalt, and also because it's safer for motorbikes as well. So I don't think there's an excuse for not having a good video appeals or stewarding system to just catch the people who do it, because almost as good as a physical deterrent is a consistent, accurate technological deterrent. If the drivers knew that going beyond the track limits in any corner, not just the corners that you can gain an advantage from, but, you know, anywhere, if they knew that every time they did it, they were getting caught, and it was accurate and it was not a mistake, and that you could prove that they were being penalised when they had genuinely gone outside the boundaries of the playing surface, the driving surface, that would be a deterrent enough. You know, there's a reason football players don't kick the ball slightly wide around, you know, when they're trying to get around a defender, because they know for a fact it will be called. The game will be stopped. They'll be penalised. They'll get, you know, the decision will go against them. And in Formula One, it's weirdly accepted that drivers can sometimes get away with sneaking beyond the edge of the track. And it just seems like such a trivially easy thing to fix in terms of having cameras on those corners, that if go-kart tracks can do it, if racing school circuits can do it, then the top motorsport in the world should be able to do this easily. So I think anything else other than that, we're just making excuses for the governing body, and I think they need to sort it out pronto.
Absolutely. That's a fair point and analysis as well, Brad. I'm glad you've talked out on that too, because it is something which can put a dampener on a result, or, you know, when we're waiting for the official kind of classifications, then you've got this kind of waiting period where you're not too sure because somebody's gone off and then the FIA don't know what they're doing. It's not great either for the teams, the drivers, or the fans. So I 100% agree with all the points you mentioned there too. And to move on to a slightly different topic as well, Brad, you know, we're recording this in the eve of silly season, to like to call it, and I know that, you know, you probably wouldn't have been able to avoid it, the whole controversy surrounding Seb retiring, Alonso going to Aston Martin, which means essentially that there's a seat at Alpine. Alpine obviously make that call on social media to promote Piastri, in which Piastri says, well, no, that's not quite correct. You've made an announcement without my consent, and actually there is no contract for me to be driving for you next season, which I think sent the entire F1 Twitter world into absolute disarray. Ironically, at the same time, the IndyCar world's gone into disarray because of Alex Palou, Chip Ganassi, and of course Big Daddy Brown as well, Zach Brown. But the question is, Brad, is I've seen a couple of old school heads saying that Oscar Piastri's in the wrong, like, because maybe he owes Alpine a moral obligation, because essentially Alpine have given him his junior career. He's featured in their junior academy quite prominently. And in a time where they need him to step up to replace Alonso, he's kind of turned his back on them and is looking for other opportunities. As a racing driver yourself, and this is a, you know, follower of the sport as well, Brad, do you buy into that? Because I don't quite see it that way, but I know everyone has their own view.
So there's a lot to unpack here. So we had a kind of 4 different events here. We had Vettel's retirement, Alonso taking Vettel's spot, Piastri being promoted but then denying he was promoted, and then the consequences that has on Ricciardo, so being the 4th thing in that kind of 4 event situation. But to answer your question a bit more directly before we go into any of those, I think a lot of credit is given to teams like Alpine for funding the junior career of drivers like Piastri, which isn't necessarily warranted. I would strongly doubt that Alpine have been the major funder in the vast majority of Piastri's junior career. I imagine he's had to find third-party sponsors to keep that career going and to fund the majority of his single-seater seasons. And the thing that Alpine will have given him is the kind of badge of being an Alpine Academy driver, maybe some small amount of funding, or maybe helping him get a slightly better deal for his sponsors in a Formula 2 team. And obviously then the running that he'll get in an old car or in the current car in free practice sessions. But in terms of the funding of his career and the majority of the effort and the finance that goes into getting him to the position he's currently in as a multiple champion of junior series, Alpine do not deserve to take the credit for that. That will be him and his management team putting together a package of sponsors to get to that point. Formula One teams generally take these junior drivers into their academies once they've already proven that they're really good. And getting to the point where you prove that you're really good is the part that takes a lot of money and expense and effort and difficulty. So I think we shouldn't give too much credit to Alpine for giving him his career in inverted commas.
Sure.
And I think that will be why he doesn't feel a massive loyalty to them, because although he'll appreciate what they have done for him, I think maybe what they've done for him is overstated, maybe in some media. So
Sure.
I also think the fact that he was potentially looking at having to hang on for another couple of years if Alonso was re-signed for a year or two, and maybe having to go to a, let's face it, back of the grid team with Williams as an alternative, which is where Alpine were looking to place him. I don't think we could blame him for looking outside of that for maybe a more competitive seat, which suits his record a bit more. And McLaren is probably quite a suitable place for him in terms of how well he's done as a junior driver and where he deserves to be. And you can't really afford to be out of a good race seat for too many seasons before your edge starts to be dulled and you stop having that momentum behind your career. And that was what he was facing, staying with Alpine. So I've maybe lost track of your original question, but I don't blame Piastri for going and looking for something else. And the fact that Alpine were a bit blindsided by Alonso jumping ship because they didn't want to give him the contract he wanted, that's not really Piastri's problem, and it's really down to him and his management team to look after his own interests and make sure he has a decent career going forward. And yeah, I can't blame any of them for thinking that didn't lie with Alpine. And you can't just expect a young driver like that to hang on and hope that maybe Alonso won't continue with the team, especially when every noise coming from Alonso and the team was that he probably was staying for at least an extra year. So that's my opinion on that. I don't blame Piastri at all. I think Alpine have done a pretty poor management job there.
Yeah, and I'm in the same camp with you as well, Brad. I don't think Piastri either owes them anything. And like you said, for me anyway, if I was in Piastri's shoes, I think the thing that would annoy me is he's won all the championships he's needed to at a junior level, as you rightfully highlighted. He's won F2. And, we've been talking a lot on the podcast as well about drivers like Nick de Vries. Like, he's done everything he needed to do. He was at McLaren at the time. For whatever reason, they didn't let him get the step up. He's had to go elsewhere now, and do world endurance driving. He's had to do Formula E. He's at the ripe age of 28, and now it's a problem for him to get a seat because of his age, which is not a factor he can control at this stage. So obviously, like you mentioned as well, if Alonso is going to stick around there and then, take that seat for a couple of years, it was really then going to put Piastri in a compromisable position. So I absolutely agree with you. And then I want to give you the rein to kind of explore this one too, because you touched on it as well. There is and there has been a bit of collateral damage to Danny Rick's kind of situation at McLaren as a result of the whole summer madness. So, what's your take and honest assessment been just on Daniel at McLaren? With Bryson, we had Bryson Sullivan, aka Natural Paradigm, talking about how certain cars or certain generations or certain teams don't suit certain drivers and the driving styles. Ricardo is renowned for being a late breaker. Obviously, with these hybrid cars, there's a lot of like hybrid regeneration that happens with the MG UK and the brake-by-wire system, which maybe is why he suffers at McLaren, amongst other things. But still, other than a race win, which came in very circumstantial situations last year in Monza, he hasn't really been able to put a torch next to Lando Norris, which I think most people expected him to do. And as a result, now it looks like he's really going to be fighting for his career in Formula One. And if anything, maybe a career either outside doing some IndyCar or maybe just doing something else that's not motorsport related at all. So, what's your take on that?
Yeah, so I don't think we can feel too sorry for Daniel Ricciardo. He's had a really fair crack at this McLaren drive. He has come into McLaren as the much more experienced driver, albeit obviously Lando Norris knew the car, etc. But for this year, you can't really even say that because it's a totally new concept. So it should have really been a reset for everyone. And Ricciardo has underperformed. And as much as I like Daniel Ricciardo, he just hasn't got to grips with last year's McLaren / this year's regulation set. Maybe it's the general feel of those cars, or maybe he is just being shown up by a better driver in Norris. Whatever the situation, and he would probably agree with this himself. I bet if you pinned him down to answer this question, I don't think you can blame McLaren for looking outside of Ricciardo for a replacement, because Norris, there's no guarantee Lando Norris is the world's best driver ever. And he's comprehensively beating Daniel pretty much all the time and has done now for quite a while. It's not just a case of Daniel needs a few races to get used to the car. He's had a whole season to get used to the team and an extra half a season and a bit more with this year's car. For whatever reason, it's not happening. And so if I was McLaren management, I'd also be looking for someone else to try and match Lando. Maybe we'll look back on this and say, yeah, maybe in a few years' time, it will turn out Lando Norris was actually the best driver of all time, and we've been a bit harsh on Ricciardo. But until that is demonstrated, and it probably won't be, I think Norris is excellent, but I don't think there's any reason to think he is, God level, the best of all time. I think it's just a case of Ricciardo doesn't get on with this year's and last year's McLaren, and maybe it's just a couple of tenths off of the ultimate pace of a 2022 top line F1 driver. And that's just how it is. And he's had a great career, and he's had a great time, and he's had some really good experiences and had some success. But maybe it is time to go, or maybe he'll go to Alpine next year and prove me completely wrong.
Absolutely, Brad. And I think it's fair, as you mentioned as well. He's had the opportunity. Bear in mind with Ricardo as well, I guess people can't really make the case for him in the sense that he's chosen this path. He was at Red Bull and seemed not to really want that smoke from Max. Then obviously he was at Alpine, which is kind of ironic because at the time it was at Renault, but it's fundamentally the same team, and decided to kind of make the move when Zach Brown called him and Sainz moved on to Ferrari. And now it's a situation where Alpine might actually be his only lifeline. So again, very interesting. But we like to be positive on this podcast. And whilst we're talking about a driver that's maybe had a bit of a decline, I want to talk about a driver that's in the ascendancy. And his name is, you might know him, his name is Bradley Philpot, man. Because bro, you're having an amazing run right now in a lot of the competitions I've seen you entered. And the next topic I wanted to get into was your mega run in the karting world championship, following your excellent performance I witnessed firsthand at the British Rental Car Championship too. So for our listeners, Brad, could you give them insight into your the competition, the World Championship in Portugal, which is amazing, getting to travel and to compete with drivers all across the world, in that competitive environment. I'll probably put this back to you again because I know I'm asking you a lot, but maybe even the training process involved, because I know you hired a new personal trainer. And also, how did you overcome some of the obstacles and challenges with such a new challenge?
Well, first of all, Denz, you're too kind. But yeah, okay. So this year I haven't done any car racing at all. I haven't done any car racing since November last year, and this year has just been karting. I did the British Rental Car Championship with you. You also competed in this back in April this year, and for the first time in a while, I made the final, which I was quite happy with, although the final didn't go too well, but just to get there, I was pretty pleased with. I'm not the youngest driver anymore, so, karting, I'm racing against people who are significantly younger than me and maybe have a bit more left to prove and a bit more desire and, maybe focus a bit more on karting. So I was quite happy to do that. Went out to the World Championship with Team M4MGB, and there's a couple of elements to that. There's a Nations Cup where the countries compete against each other, and then there's the individual competition. In the Nations Cup, our team was good, but we were done over by bad karts. And in the individual competition, although I was actually really happy with my own performance, the nature of this competition is that you're at the behest of the karts you're given. You get 8 karts over the heat rounds, and then another one for the semis and another one for the final if you get that far. And without wanting to just slag off an organisation or a competition, it was pretty bad this year. The kart parity was really bad, and so the differences between each kart were much bigger than the differences in the driving. So you'd have drivers who were, say 0.2 of a second apart on lap time. But with karts that are 2 seconds apart, then it's a foregone conclusion who's going to win. It's just whoever gets the better kart. So I was really happy with my performance. I didn't make it to the final, I made it to the semi-finals. But anyway, there are plans afoot in the background to hopefully redress this issue in the future. But to kind of answer your real question, I've been trying to get back to my youth. Enjoy karting, enjoy competing on a world stage in kart championships, and that's probably, from a financial point of view, what I'm going to be doing over the next few years, because it's unlikely that I'll be able to put a sponsorship package together which is good enough to do the kind of car racing which I would want to be doing, which is, as you know, Denz, GT3 racing, GT4 racing, that kind of level, and I'm not really personally interested in a lower series than that. So I'd rather be competing on a world level at karting than on a kind of a regional or local level in a hatchback car race or something to that effect. So
Sure.
you're very kind to point out those things that I've been up to, and hopefully I'll get to do a few more in the future. And British Rental Kart Championship entries open next week. If anybody's interested in having a look at that, just head to brkc.co.uk.
Awesome. And Brad, I'm going to come back. I'm really glad you mentioned that too, because we're going to come back to that. And I actually want to use this opportunity, this platform, this moment as well to upsell, the BRKC, because it was a phenomenal event for me in April. Had the time of my life, learned so much, left as a better driver, but we'll come back to it. Another thing I wanted, you to kind of elaborate on as well, because I saw you make a few posts about it. The fitness aspect of it as well, man. Like driving those cars, even for me, I was like, geez, it's a lot of work. I enjoyed it. It was fun, but physically it took it out of me. And I know that you've been taking your fitness very seriously this year. You've been trying to make improvements and trying to find an edge, where you can. Could you talk to our listeners about that as well, and just how physically demanding karting is, especially, in the Portuguese heat or in foreign kind of areas where, you don't have the privilege of going to your local track and practicing all the time?
Yeah, definitely. So essentially, the more grip and the faster a vehicle, whether it's a kart or a car, is, the more your personal fitness will help you out. And essentially, you don't ever really want to be distracted by being tired or being physically out of breath or feeling that fatigue. You want to always be able to just operate subconsciously and without any physical effort. In order to do that, you do need to train. And like you point out, I found a personal trainer, a guy called Junior, at my local gym, who was absolute legend, who helped me over a period of several months. I was at the gym with him multiple times per week, and I definitely, at 36 years old, I'm not particularly young anymore, but at 36, I was the fittest I'd ever been. And that's one element of being out in Portugal over the last 10 days or so that was really positive. It didn't matter how long the races were, how hot the races were. I never once thought about being tired. There was no physical exertion that distracted me or took away any lap time. I can't point to that as any kind of excuse. Whereas in the past, maybe it would have done. It might not have made all the difference, but at the times where you're at your limit and you're really mentally tired and you're physically pushing very hard, maybe a tenth or two would have been lost through suffering physically, and that definitely was not the case this time out. I felt absolutely fit as a fiddle the whole time. In the week or so after that competition's finished, I've maybe let that slide a bit, but I am planning on getting back to the gym soon. I've just kind of, after 4 months, basically 4 months of pushing flat out with that goal of being at the Kart World Championship and being in the peak physical condition, there was a lot of effort, a lot of time and physical effort putting in those training sessions. And I'm just having a bit of a week off at the moment, enjoying my
It's well
time,
deserved.
having a red wine and just chilling out. But yeah, if anyone's got any kind of sporting event, whether it's karting or car racing or anything else in mind, you probably know training for it and putting yourself in the best physical shape possible helps you no end. And as you experienced at BRKC, even on an indoor track, when you're at that level and everyone else is so good, any extra edge you can have over them helps you. So yeah, maybe if you join us again in January, maybe that'll be you.
Oh, thank you, Brad. And also, must I say, man, bro, enjoy it, man. You've been working so hard. You haven't rested. You're like, good. Like, I think you rested on the 7th day or something like that, man. But genuinely is good, to catch actually like a break, and to take a bit of a kind of, breath from it all, and you've been working exceptionally hard. I know. And big shout out to Junior as well, because I know, you'd have been pushing you, to the limits. And I also can attest to everything you mentioned there too. When I took part at, the Brit Kart Championship, it was so intense, and even this the corners were so demanding. I remember that long left-hander, which is kind of reminiscent of turn 13 at like Turkey, Istanbul, and it's a long sweeping left-hander, and you're essentially like gripping the wheel and trying to turn in and keep to the inside line where all the grip is, all the rubbers kind of rub it into the tarmac, and essentially just having to just hold on for dear life. And as the stint was going on, I could feel my neck kind of caving in and having to kind of like, prop myself up in the seat. And as you mentioned, it's as much physical as is mental when you're going up against the top echelon of competitors in these series. Every single thing makes a huge difference, and if you lock up a wheel, if you make a mistake, if you turn in too late because your arms are feeling fatigued, all of these things cost you lap time, which you don't need. It's the peak of performance. So definitely agree with you on that as well, and I'm glad I actually experienced it firsthand. I wish we could have that kind of pleasure with everybody, so they could appreciate just the hard work and effort that goes into it. And as a segment as well, Brad, I really like to take this opportunity to upsell BRKC, the British Rental Car Championship, because it was such an amazing vibe. We touched on it earlier in the year and we did a review, but just generally, you mentioned on some key things, and I actually want to take this opportunity to explain it. Just, when you're taking part in these championships, some providers, and, I'm not going to throw shade at some providers, the carts are not necessarily equal, and then that creates a huge issue because you go there, you've made all the prep that you can to try and compete at the top level, but then if you're given a cart which has got like a ballast or an imperfection or hasn't been maintained properly mechanically, and it puts you at a deficit compared to other people, then that's a huge disadvantage. And the one thing I could say about the BRKC, and shout out to all the stewards, all the on-site mechanics, all the catering staff, everybody from like the ground up into the commentators were just legendary, and they really made it a great event. When I went there, I felt I was offered a fair and equal opportunity to go up against the best and equal machinery, which is part and parcel of the fun and the competitive nature, so it really was whoever was the best driver won, which was really great to see as well. And just shout out to M4M as well, as part of my kind of esports career I'm doing at the moment. I always have BRKC plastered on the car and M4M as well. But can you also, from your side, explain and just, demonstrate the differences, obviously, between the great series like BRKC and, some other kind of events where, the cards are maybe not equal or there are other deficiencies in the way it's run?
Yeah, of course. I mean, this is a topic that's really close to my heart. I don't want to bore the listeners too much, but I've founded the British Rental Car Championship in 2011, and we had reasonably high aspirations in terms of we want it to be a very fair competition, but we were really quite naive in terms of what it took to deliver that and to give people equal machinery and really make it a fair competition. And I'd like to think over the preceding kind of 10 years or so, more than 10 years now, that we've arrived at a point where we understand, and the circuit that run the karts and all the people involved understand how important, how fundamental to a competition like that the karts and the equality of those karts are to making the championship work. They not only make it a more genuine competition, but it also actually makes the racing better, because people don't feel the need to make dirty moves or go for lunges that aren't necessary. When the karts are equal and you put the best drivers in them, you actually end up with a really close, fair race. And so the level of, just to put it into context, the kart testers are working until 4-5 in the morning before the race. They won't stop all night going through the fleet, driving every single kart and logging lap times and then adjusting them. They have a system basically with various restrictor sizes to very, very small adjustments, but to try and bring every kart within a maximum of 0.2 of a second. But the aim is obviously to make them identical. And that really, it makes me really happy then when the competition runs and you don't hear drivers talking about the karts. The hallmark of a well-run kart event is when the drivers are talking about other stuff, not the karts. It's going a bit wrong when you hear people saying things like, oh yeah, I really want to get kart 13 in the next race because that's the quick one. Or I hope I don't get kart 2 because that one's rubbish. When you hear that, there's a pattern forming. There are some obvious performance differences becoming apparent, and the equalization team, the mechanics, haven't nailed it. But I think that the one you entered this year, 2022, in April, I didn't hear a single gripe about karts. In fact, I don't think drivers cared which kart they drew. And just for the listeners, when you arrive in the pit lane before your next race, you actually draw a kart at random from a bag. There's like a bag full of ping pong balls that have numbers on, and you draw a kart, and provided you haven't already driven that one, that's the one you drive. You draw it blindly, so it's entirely random and fair, and you don't ever drive the same one twice. But even with that system in place, it's still better if they're all just the same. And I don't think anyone cared. I think if you drew kart 12 or kart 1 or kart 7, you didn't really care because they were all the same. Sure. So that's our aim, and that should be the aim, I think, of all rental kart high level competitions, because it's supposed to be about the driver. It's supposed to be about who does the best job on the day or on the weekend or on the week. So that's certainly what we aim to do.
Oh, well, Brad, I think you guys achieve it phenomenally, and even just from my experience, I always say I'm the Black Michael Schumacher, and I make all of these kind of funny jokes. But when I got there, I was humbled, man. I was really humbled. I went from being the Black Michael Schumacher to Lawrence Stroll. Lawrence Stroll's second son, because it was just like, wow, you really appreciate this for the phenomenal amount of talent. And I remember even being in a race with you, and then you coming up to lap me. I was like, let me try and get out Brad's way if he kills me. So yeah, and then even guys like Ruben Bolton's the Dutch kind of national top driver, and even other legendary names there as well, like Ramon Pinheiro, again an F2 race winner. So the caliber of driving was absolutely sensational. I think I left a better driver, and I hope, and well, not even hope, it definitely needs to happen as well. I'm sure Georgina will put a link out with the episode as well for any karters, anybody wanting to participate, to get the registrations in as soon as the official registrations are open for the British Rental Kart Championship as well. But I'm really glad we discussed that too, Brad.
Thanks, Des. And yeah, and like I say, they open in a week. So the drivers who finished in the top 30 this year get priority entry for 1 week. So we know it tends to sell out immediately. So the moment we put the entries up, within 5 minutes, they're all gone. So the way we do this is to give the previous season's drivers who have done the best job a bit more of a relaxing entry process. We give them a week to enter with no pressure. So from this Sunday coming, so I think it's the 14th of August, for a week, if you finish in the top 30, you can enter whenever you want. But the moment that week's finished, it's effectively a free-for-all. We open 30 entries each day for the following few days until all of them are gone. So yeah, so start checking us out. www.brkc.co.uk from this coming Sunday, the 14th.
Excellent stuff, Brad. And thank you for plugging that too, because it's something I really hold close to my heart as well. And I think I hold it that way because, it was such an amazing experience for me, so memorable. And even just the staff, just from the other fellow carters to, just like even the catering staff and the people at reception and the marshals and the technicians, everybody was awesome, man. And I made some friends as well. So definitely a great experience. Now, to change it up a bit as well, Brad, we've talked about Formula One racing, we've talked about go-kart racing. One kind of racing we haven't talked about so much is sim racing, and we know that this year as well, when you have been at home in the sim rig, you've been engaging a lot more with the IndyCar and you've been taking part in the IndyCar esports races too that are held by iRacing. It's an interesting topic, this, because very recently iRacing held its biggest esports event that it has throughout the year, the Spa 24 hours, which is just like teams of professional esport guys coming together and in teams racing in a 24-hour endurance race, just like they do in real life. And something that propped up that I'm sure you probably saw as well is people exploiting kind of a bug with the simulator where they're driving on the grass to cool the tires, which doesn't really work like that in real life. But I like the thinking, and just the push for performance was real. Put it that way. We even had Davide De Rossi's, the Williams sim racing engineer as well, talk about how competitive sim racing is and the lengths people will go to. But bringing it back to you, Brad, I know that obviously as well, you do a lot of testing. You're a professional like tire tester for Goodyear as well, huge tire company. In relation to the tire model in simulators, how do you think they compare to real life, tires in terms of warm-up characteristics, tire degradation, and what would you like to see from the sim world to make steps forward in it, like to replicate real life as such?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's a difficult one to answer because I always feel like tires in racing sims are a real approximation of reality. I think a tire is such a complex piece of equipment that changes so quickly and so dramatically depending on so many different circumstances that it almost feels like you'd need a supercomputer per tire in order to accurately model what was really going on. And so I feel like we all just accept that in a sim, the tires maybe feel slightly slippery when they're cold, they warm up a bit, and then they give you a certain amount of grip, unless you then push too hard and they overheat. But it's quite a basic model, and you don't really have, if you take a close up of an iRacing replay and you see a tire moving across a curb, the tire's not responding like a real tire does. There's no inflation there. You don't see the squish of the tire. You don't see differences in pressure. You don't see the way the sidewall is interacting differently with the environment to the tread, and the tread is warming up and squashing independently of the rest of the carcass. I think a tire is a vastly more complex thing than obviously most people would give it credit for, and I don't think we have the computing power to do a good enough job at the moment of making them feel real. So I actually feel like maybe what we have at present is kind of an okay compromise. In terms of the kind of Spa 24-hour where they were driving down the grass to cool things off, that's more of an iRacing bug. People are always going to exploit. If there's a way to make it quicker, regardless of whether it's actually realistic or not, people will do it if they work it out. And yeah, if the limiting factor is the tires getting slightly too hot and having slightly less grip in their grip algorithm, and a way to cool that off is to drive on the grass down the straights, then people are going to do that. And I think that's more of a thing for iRacing to try and stamp out by not having the issue in the first place, by not having an unrealistic interaction between the tire and the environment. but I don't blame simulators or sim companies for not having a perfect tire model, because I just think it is such a complex thing. I mean, I see in my day job, I'm out here this week in the south of France testing various tires, and one of the things we'll be testing will be different materials inside the construction of various tires. And there'll be things that people probably have no idea are even in a tire, and all we're doing is changing manufacturer. It's probably the same chemical structure, but it's just coming from a different supplier. But that will still affect how that tire performs over a number of laps. And when you're getting into that kind of detail, you can understand why it's probably impossible for a simulator company who doesn't have anything like that level of information, let alone computing power. It's pretty impossible for them to do it brilliantly, especially because you're having to cope with thousands of different people that have different computing specs, and
Sure.
you're having to account for that as well. So yeah, I've answered that in a really long-winded way, but I don't think the tire models we have nowadays are terrible. I think we've got a pretty decent approximation of how a real-world tire works, but I think we've got probably decades to go in terms of computing improvements before we get a tire model which works like a real world tire. Hopefully that makes some kind of sense.
Absolutely, and I think what I try and do as well, Brad, I don't know if you notice this, with these podcasts, I try and be as encompassing as I can so we can reach out to all the different people, the sim racing nerds, or shout out to them. I'm a sim racing nerd too, before you give me hate. And, like the Formula One heads, the Indy heads, the guys into the regulations, the guys into a bit of the rumors. I really try and keep it wide. So I'm glad that we touched on this too, because it is something that was quite prevalent and a bit memeable within the sim racing community. And also, Brad, just out of interest, just on a short one too, have you tried any other simulators like on in your spare time? Because there's other ones as well, like Assetto Corsa Competizione, and one of their developers, like Aris, is like a tire like nerd. Like he's really, really obsessed with tires, man. And like he was talking about like the characteristics of the Pirelli tire in the GT3 series for the SRO, and how if you basically go over curbs in the first couple of laps, you basically knock the tire pressure down, which won't give you the optimal psi's you need, which apparently for GT3 car is about 27.5 psi. And then on top of that as well, like if it's extremely hot, the track surface, then you can get blistering, and you can get what's the other one? Blistering and
Graining, probably.
graining. There we go. Thank you so much, man. You saved my bacon there. Yeah, just like and stuff like that too. So it seems that they're a bit more radical with their kind of like simulations of that. Just out of interest, have you tried it at all?
Yeah, so I started my simulator life with R Factor, moved to R Factor 2. I've driven Assetto Corsa, but definitely the predominant sim I've used is iRacing, mainly for the racing infrastructure that exists in terms of
Sure.
the competitions. Because when it comes down to it, I'm not an engineer, I'm a driver at the end of the day,
Sure.
and I race and drive for the racing side of things. I am interested in the technological side and the engineering side, but really the thing that gets me going is the competition between people. And I think iRacing
Sure.
has the best structure for that. But yeah, I've driven the others, and I enjoy Assetto Corsa, but I'd be lying if I claimed to know in detail, how well they model different aspects of things like tires. So I'll take your word for that.
Man, maybe this is a suggestion as well, Brad, man, because in the sim racing community, we miss you too. And, hopefully at some stage when you are less busy, we can get more of those M4M events as well, because they're so much fun. But, to go full circle and to kind of touch on another topic, which you just outlined quite nicely earlier on in this podcast, Ferrari, man, just they've really struggled this year, in terms of either reliability or strategy. And again, just from a driver's perspective as well, Brad, like when you're a driver in Charles's shoes, and you're driving for a legacy brand like Ferrari, which can be quite political, and they don't like drivers being outspoken, as we saw with Alan Prost many years ago when he made some very derogatory comments towards the car and the team. What goes through your mind as the driver, Brad? Because is there anything that Charles can do to influence the team and their strategies to improve the results? Because just to kind of flesh it out a bit more and alley-oop it to you, we saw the situation in France where essentially, I know you might not have watched the full thing, but Charles did all the hard groundwork on Saturday. He put the car on pole, and the Ferrari seemed to run with like not a high downforce setup, but a setup that was definitely on the emphasis of downforce. So had a car that was very good in the first sector, very vulnerable in the second sector with the straights and the chicane, and then would pull away again from the Red Bull in the third sectors. That was the trend. But then Red Bull, with the strategy caps on, decided to pull the trigger by bringing Max in for the undercut. Ferrari didn't respond immediately to that undercut, which left Charles in a very vulnerable position where I felt he was having to drive the car over the limit on the worn tires to reduce any deficit that was going to be created by the tire offset and Max pulling the undercut, to which he then makes a huge catastrophic mistake by his own standards and admission. And it created like a big storm on the internet and a lot of conspiracies about the throttle pedal, whether something happened there. We're not going to get really so much into that. But just, again, in terms of the psychological aspect, Brad, bringing it back to the question, when you're in like Charles's shoes and Sainz's shoes too, and it feels like you have to nanny the team, is there much you can do, or is that like a lose-lose situation?
I think as a driver, you have to focus on your side of things primarily. I think the vast majority of the time, Leclerc does a great job. You could point to a couple of errors that are maybe predominantly at his feet, but as you pointed out, the position Ferrari put him in the majority of the time, when those errors occur, you can pretty much put them down to the position he's been put in. Had the car been reliable from the outset, and I'm talking about across the season, and strategic errors been avoided, and the easy wins had happened when they should have done, he wouldn't have been in a position where he needed to take as many risks and drive as hard as possible on worn out tires, etc. And so I do have to put most of the blame for the situation Ferrari find themselves in at the team's feet, because no matter what you say about how the drivers could influence strategy, or maybe make their own calls, we've seen some people do. Sainz is a good example. Of Monaco, for example, of kind of strategizing his own race. Vettel used to do it all the time when he was at Ferrari. They shouldn't have to do that. That's not their job. Sure. They're drilled from a young age to trust the team. The team are the ones with all the data. The team are the ones with the outside view, watching the bigger picture. As a driver, even if you're a brilliantly skilled driver with lots of extra mental capacity who's able to kind of take in the greater race and what everyone else is doing for pit strategy and stuff around you, you shouldn't have to. That shouldn't be your prime focus. And I don't think you see that. If you point to Verstappen and the majority of races he's won, I don't think even in his best races you'd point to Verstappen and say he drove the strategy for the team. I think he's doing what he's told, and his job is to drive the car as fast as possible and not make any mistakes. And the team's job is to read the strategy correctly. And the problem with Ferrari is too often they've been in a position where people on their sofas with limited information can make better calls than the team seem to be able to make on the pit wall with all the information that you could ever hope for. I don't think we need to let them off the hook for that. I think Ferrari are really the orchestrators of their own downfall here this season, and they're the ones that have put themselves so far behind Red Bull, not just from reliability or obvious strategic blunders when they've been leading, but also from not prioritizing Leclerc when it's obvious that he's the one with the championship shout, and kind of almost trying to appease Sainz. As much as we like Sainz and think he does a great job, it's been pretty clear for quite a while that Leclerc is the one with the the potential for beating Verstappen to the championship, and they have tried to be too fair, which is very un-Ferrari. So yeah, I don't blame Leclerc at all for not just running his own strategy.
Yeah, and I think that's fair as well, Brad. And thank you, for that all-encompassing kind of review on that too, because you said a lot of things that were on my mind. When I've contemplated them and their performance this year, a lot of like missed opportunities, which is unfortunate. And even just from like a fan perspective too, we've got another championship on our hands. It's a new formula. essentially we thought it would have basically reset everybody in the ideal world and given everybody a fighting chance. But you can't take away from Red Bull. They've been doing what they need to do, and it's been Ferrari that have been letting them off the hook and giving them an easy run of it. So they definitely need to kind of step up the game and kind of make sure that they are a lot more tighter with the decision making and, with making more informed decisions and believing more in the drivers too, but also like dictating the strategy when it needs to be dictated in the correct way as well. Because there's certain things which are just unexplainable, like why they put Charles in a hard tire when it was very abundantly clear to everyone at that stage the hard tire was not the great tire to be on in that particular situation with the tires and the operating window they required to get fired up, for the optimal performance. So I definitely agree with you on that as well. And yeah, real shame as well, man, because I like Charles. I like that kind of killer instinct he has and that almost PlayStation generation type aggression he has. But then on the flip side too, science as well has been at the feet of some bad luck and some weird and mysterious strategy calls that will probably end up on unsolved mysteries someday in the future. So I'm glad we discussed that too, and we kept it respectful to Ferrari in that regard as well, because we could have gone a lot further. And just to round this podcast up, Brad, thank you for your time as well, because I know you're a busy guy. I know you're always up to something, and just like it's amazing to have you and your perspective and what you can bring to us and our listeners as well. But I just wanted to get your perspective too of just your predictions for the rest of the season. I know that you've already kind of preempted that it looks like it's safe in the back for Red Bull, so maybe we won't spend too much time on them. But what have you made of Mercedes? I don't think we've touched too much on obviously the resurgence that they're kind of having at the moment with ironing out the deficiencies of W13, Lewis and George looking like one of the strongest pairings on the grid. And also as well, what have you made of Formula B in terms of the next set of like cars in the line? Because Uncle Alonso seems to have been on a mighty, run of form, although he's had some bad luck. And also Lando's not always had a competitive McLaren to fight with, but when he can, he's got the resources he's needed to. So, what have you thought of the midfield and the kind of Mercedes play at the moment?
Yeah, so as much as I've just kind of given Ferrari a hard time, Mercedes have also let both of those teams off the hook by having a bit of a poor car in the early stage of this year. It looks like they're getting on top of it. Maybe that's a really good thing for the future, and maybe the fact they've got quite a unique concept that they're getting on top of will mean that if they nail that and they do make it very fast, then it'll be harder for other people to copy. But let's see what happens. My predictions from that respect are that, particularly with the rules change coming in with the flexi floors at Spa, that hopefully Mercedes will be genuinely in that fight, as opposed to being slightly at arm's length and picking up the pieces when one of the top two teams messes up. So I hope that we'll have a real three-way fight for the remainder of the season. But as we mentioned, I think Red Bull have got everything sewn up in terms of championships this year. It'll be interesting to see whether Mercedes can actually overhaul Ferrari and end up as the second best team by the end of the season. In terms of Formula B, really Alpine and McLaren. I think Alpine have actually more recently had a bit of an edge. I think in terms of driving talent, it's actually Norris who is probably doing the better job for me. But Norris and Alonso are pretty standout drivers in my view, and makes it all the more surprising for me that Alonso has jumped ship, because it looked like Alpine were potentially going places. But yeah, for the remainder of the season, I'll just be watching with interest and seeing whether it's blue or orange that comes out on top in that second kind of tier formula for second place. I've got a hunch it's probably Alpine, given Ricciardo's underperformance, but we'll see.
Yeah, fair. I think that's fair as well, Brad. And also, before we wrap it up as well, have you been watching any of the other series? Because IndyCar has been very spicy this year too. With at one stage, Marcus Ericsson hit us, leading the championship after a very interesting Indy 500 Grand Prix. We've also had the likes of Scott Dixon, a veteran driver, and now the second most winningest driver in the series, kind of coming and finding form. The Penske guys of Newgarden and McLaughlin seem up there, and the fan favorites Colton Herta and Pato Ward have had the edge. And then you mentioned GT3 as well. Obviously, me being a Merc boy, I'm going to have to support Raffaello Marcello and the Codis ASP team too. In the sprint and the endurance series, they seem to have had the edge on the Audi and also the M4 in the endurance series, which I take been on just the pond generally, and I'm really hoping as well. I've always said that my dream lineup one day would be you, Lewis Hamilton, and Raffaello Marcello in a GT3 car. That would be sick. I know what your response is going to be to that, but still, that's my dream, and that's the stand of that. So yeah, but what's your take been on the other sports as well, man?
Yeah, so IndyCar, definitely I've been paying much closer attention to this year, primarily because Sky Sports F1 have been covering it. So it's been quite easy to watch Sunday evenings, quite a convenient time to stick something on the telly. I tried to watch yesterday's IndyCar race, and I watched the majority of it, but knowing I had a flight first thing in the morning, I did have to go to sleep eventually with their rain delay. But I see Grosjean was taken out by, was it Dixon in the end? And
a new garden.
The only
new
thing,
garden.
New Garden, yeah, sorry, a New Garden, and Dixon won, didn't he? So my only gripe with IndyCar really is that there's so much advantage given unfairly to people who happen to have pitted on a lucky lap just before a caution comes out. I think we saw that yesterday. You had McLaughlin and Grosjean pretty clear out front, and then cautions just happening at the wrong time just hand the advantage to someone else, which is I don't really like that. I don't like that kind of lottery element to it. But anyway, that's how it is. And I've enjoyed the racing, and I love the cars, and I love how they're able to race. GT3, I definitely haven't really watched any of, but I'll certainly take your dream team. That would be a very nice team, and I would be shown to be extremely bad by comparison to those two drivers.
Man, don't say that.
But it would be awesome all the same, and I'd still take that opportunity. But yeah, I've just not had time to really. Formula One and IndyCar, and obviously the occasional Formula 2 race, they've been my main series I've been paying attention to this year. I've just been so busy. Aside from that, I've not really been able to catch much else.
Sure, and that's fair as well, man. And we know you're a busy guy, Brad, and we appreciate you as always. Taking time out and coming back. I remember the first episode was super popular with our listeners. So it's always great to have you back, and even just getting to know you outside and through the visor. Cheeky plug there as well. You're an amazing guy. So I'm very thankful to you as well for the opportunities you've given me, to learn more and to, make my passion a reality, which, I can't say for too many other people. So thank you. But Brad, I'll let you have the final word, man. Like, are there any projects or, any other things you're looking to do for the rest of the year that you can disclose with your adoring fans and listeners? And is there any other final words you wanted to say?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for having me on. Thanks to you and Jorgy for having me on the podcast. We do have a really big project in the works that I can't say anything about, which I'm really frustrated about, but I'll let you know as soon as I'm allowed to say something, which will hopefully be in the next couple of weeks or so. But yeah, real big motorsport project that I'd like lots of people to know about that I'm not allowed to mention yet, but we'll get onto that another time, maybe next time I'm on. We already mentioned British Rental Kart Championships. That's really the key thing. If you've got any interest in karting, particularly if you're in the UK and you'd like to race in a really competitive racing series that is really based upon being as fair as possible, but also making you feel special and like a real pro driver and giving you the opportunity to race against the best in the world, check out brkc.co.uk, the British Rental Kart Championship. And as we said earlier, the entries go live in just under 1 week's time and 2 weeks' time for everyone who wasn't in the top 30 this year. Go check it out.
Major, Brad. Thank you for that as well. And I'm sure Jorgy's going to put the links out there as well. So, and that's the thing I like with it too, man. Obviously, you've got the veteran karters that will show up inevitably, put on the show. But you never know, like, if you might find the next Lewis or the next Lando or the next George, that will come up. Because when I was in the car park, chilling and trying to just basically spend some time, the amount of parents I saw as well with these young kids, and you see the focus in the eye and how much it meant to them too. I was like, this could be the future, and it'd be amazing as well if we look back in years to come and we're like, yeah, I remember that name. absolutely dive bomb me into turn 2. Visor, right, that kid. So yeah, and also big shout out to yourself as well, Brad. Keep up the excellent work you're doing with the channel as well, and you have time to through the Visor. It's such a credible source of information and a great hub for learning as well. We really encourage people's learning and development, L&D, on this channel as well. So again, we're super proud of you, man. Keep your head up. Ignore the haters, bro, as always. And just keep shining, man. You're an exemplary example and role model to a lot of us. And we always wish you the best, man.
Thank you very much. Thanks to you and Jorgy for having me on.
No worries at all, man. Well, guys, that's been Brad Philpot, the man, the myth, the legend, as I love to say. Huge shout out to him and his coaching and development with me, off the track and in sim racing as well. And, his time on this episode too. Make sure you guys give him a follow. Make sure you guys check out the British Rental Car Championship as well and follow his YouTube channel. And from us at Stripping the Dip In, it's been your boy AMG Denz, aka Modern Day Morgan Freeman. And I'm out. Peace.